So hello. Welcome to Concept 102. It says SAT Worksheet 102 at the top, but this is also applicable to the ACT. What we're going to be looking at is the second set of core grammar concepts that show up frequently on both the 75 English problems on section 1 of the ACT and the 44 English problems on section 2 of the SAT. And both tests equally test for these concepts. So a lot of students see dashes and they're not exactly sure what to make of dashes. Commas have a number of different uses, and we'll explain many of them here, how to use them correctly and incorrectly. We'll talk about appositive clauses and so on. So let's just get right into it. So a big part of both tests is something called a parenthetical phrase. So in the US, brackets are called parentheses. It's the same idea in that you're looking at an piece of information that is non-essential to the sentence. So from Concept 101, Worksheet 101, you remember that a clause is the essential DNA of a sentence. It has a subject and a verb, and an independent clause completes the idea. So anything that's part of a parenthetical clause or phrase is not part of your independent clause. It is just additional information that is non-essential or irrelevant. So let's kind of take a look at what form this takes. So sometimes you'll have an independent clause. In this case, and I'll do this in green, I'll make this a little bigger. So we have Mira, her mother observed. So we have Mira, her mother observed, always enjoys watching the floor routine and balance beam Olympic events. So Mira always enjoys watching the floor routine and balance beam Olympic events is your independent clause. Mira is your subject. Enjoys is your verb, and we've completed our idea. So her mother observed is completely non-essential. It's just some additional detail that gives us the person's perspective, but it's completely an interruption. So the way we set something apart as non-essential is we have three options. The three options are we can use dashes, commas, or brackets or parentheses. So dashes come up a lot on the test, and a lot of times students are a little puzzled. Dashes only have one role, and that one role is to set something aside as non-essential. So in this case, her mother observed is bracketed by two dashes. Your independent clause is what's outside of that. You could take this out and the sentence wouldn't skip a beat. What you could also do is you could also have your independent clause before the dash. So Alicia cheered on her favorite team is your independent clause. Alicia is your subject. Cheered is your verb. We complete the idea. And then heavy underdogs in the match is just some additional information. And that's signaled by the fact that it follows a dash, and then we close it out with the period. So those are the two forms dashes can take. You need two if you are interrupting your independent clause right in the middle, or just one if you already have your independent clause and it's just some additional information. As you get really good at this test, you'll start to be able to almost ignore these parenthetical bits that have no bearing on your answer. And it will really make it a lot easier to focus on what matters on the problems. But anyway, the other way you can show that something is parenthetical or non-essential is with two commas. Commas have a number of different uses, but that's one, is to set something off as non-essential, or you can put brackets. Just like with the dash, if your independent clause comes before, you can just do a comma and then just provide the extra information. This is what's called an appositive. It's just kind of an added noun descriptor about what came before. But you don't need to necessarily know that word, just kind of how this thing is functioning. And then obviously brackets is the most removed. They don't come up that often, brackets. If you have one bracket, you always have to have a second bracket. So that makes it different than the other two. Okay. Another thing you tend to get maybe once a test is you get a question that involves quotes. So there are three ways to use quotes. The first way we kind of learn at a young age is to put a comma before we quote, right? In this case, sheriff shared, comma, and then we have quotation marks. That's actually only true if it's explicitly someone speaking or thinking, and you're clearly showing that you're using like shared, thought, claimed, whatever it may be. You're showing that they're about to speak and it's attributed to them. But if you pick up a newspaper, and what you'll see more often on the test is an embedded quote. An embedded quote is where the sentence just flows without necessarily introducing the quote. The words just kind of fit into the sentence. It doesn't skip a beat. And you just know by the quotation marks that the words are attributed to the person. So in this case, Sheriff shared that he doesn't normally eat tacos on Tuesdays, but he'll make an exception. So we can tell because of the quotation marks that these are Sheriff's words, but we don't need any comma before the quotes because of the fact that it's just embedded. This is something you'll see very rarely on the test. More often you'll use this when you write like a research paper. But if you have a full independent clause before the quote, so Sheriff promised to break out of his shell in an effort to further our relationship. So that's a full independent clause, and it's an assertion that stands on its own. If you decide to then quote after that at length, a lot of times you'll use a colon. But that tends to be if you have like a long quote where you are quoting 4 or more lines. Number 2 is kind of the default. That's what you're most likely to say, but you do want to be aware of all 3. Okay. So then also, a lot of times students have questions about a colon, and I know we're just hitting the most common punctuation topics outside of what we covered on the 101 worksheet. So we did touch on the colon on the 101 worksheet, but here we're going to touch on it a little further. In fact, I'm going to show you the most common error that comes up on the test with the colon, and you're going to try to figure out why this is incorrect. So I'll give you a moment to look at it while I take a quick sip of coffee. Okay. So most students will say, oh, this is perfect. This looks great. I know that colons are used with lists. And here we have a list. We say such as to lead into the list. So this looks great. Actually, it's always wrong. And it's 100% wrong. And no matter how bad you may want it to be right, it's still wrong. Anyway, test is going to try this on you. Don't let them get it by you. The reason why this doesn't work, if you remember, is when you use a colon, you have to have an independent clause before the colon. After the colon can be anything. It can be an independent clause, a dependent clause, a list. The only rule after the colon is it has to further expand upon or explain the first part. So if you think about it, that's what a list does, right? Jimmy enjoys many types of cereals, and then we explain what types of cereals in the list. The issue, though, and hopefully you've spotted, is Jimmy enjoys many types of cereals, such as, that's not an independent clause. So the minute you use a word like such as, consisting of, including, you ditch the colon. So this example is how we could use such as. The one above it is how we would use the colon. Jimmy enjoys many types of cereals. Now that's an independent clause. Now we're allowed to use the colon. Or Jimmy enjoys many types of cereals, such as, and then we list them. But you never use both. And you'll see a few of those when you do the problems on this worksheet. Okay, so comma, correct versus incorrect uses. So let me quickly name a couple of common uses of a comma. And there's more in your UES workbook if you want to kind of look those through. But then we'll also briefly look at incorrect uses. So correct uses would be in a list, often with the Oxford comma. So if you have 3 or more items, so if I said something like Becky ate apples, oranges, and pears. So whenever you have a list of 3 or more items, you have to put a comma between the items, and you do put the comma before the end for US grammar. So that's one use of commas. Another common use, other than the parenthetical one that you saw above when you set apart something as non-essential, another common use for a comma is if you have multiple adjectives all describing the same noun, and you can say "and" between them. So an example of this would be the big, comma, black spider. So because I can say the big and black spider, I put a comma between big and black, and they both describe spider. So that's like another instance of when you'd use a comma. Also, if you remember from worksheet 101, you can use a comma with a coordinating conjunction, one of your fanboys, to hold up two independent clauses. So an example of this would be Ralph ate pizza, comma with and, which is one of your fanboys, and he felt full. So that comma is holding up the two independent clauses. So those are some common uses of commas. And whenever you use a comma, it always has a clear intention. So here are 4 ways that the test will play a game of chicken with you and try to make you think you need a comma when you don't. They'll try to get you to flinch. The most common one is when you have back-to-back independent clauses. So, or not back-to-back independent clauses, I apologize, prepositional phrases. So prepositions are of, by, with, between, against. Feel free to look up preposition. But with these prepositional phrases, we have by the pond, near the gate. You don't want to put a comma between pond and near the gate, because by the pond is modifying the duck and near the gate is modifying the pond, and you don't want any interference between the two. So a lot of times if you have back-to-back prepositional phrases, no comma is needed. If you're more interested in that, you can either do some research on your own or you can ask your tutor about it. Again, we don't want to put a comma between the prepositional phrase by the pond and the noun that it's describing, the duck. So again, this comma is incorrect. For the same reason that you really wouldn't want to put a comma between the adjective little and the noun girl. Just like we want by the pond, that prepositional phrase, to describe duck without any interference, we want little, this adjective, to describe girl without any interference. And then last but not least, sometimes you'll see a comma between the subject and the verb that immediately follows it. That's also a big no-no. So when you see a comma, just kind of say to yourself, is it actually serving a purpose, or is it just thrown in there randomly? And these are the 4 most common random ways that a comma will sabotage a sentence. All right, let's quickly talk about these relative pronouns. So that, who, and which show up a good amount on the test. It's good to kind of understand the differences between them. Here are 3 sentences. I want you to look at these 3. The big thing is that this third one is significantly different than the first 2. So what you'll notice, and you may have caught this, and feel free to pause the video if you haven't completely thought about this yet, but what you'll notice is this isn't talking about just the players arriving early, it's talking about a specific group of players. So that, when it comes after a noun, it restricts the noun or makes it more specific. So in this case, only the players that wanted extra practice arrived early. Same with who when it comes without a comma. It does the same thing that does. This last one, though, if you remember the parenthetical or non-essential clauses from earlier, in this case, who wanted extra practice is just additional information about all of the players, but all of the players arrived early. So whenever you see a who or a which, you want to see whether or not a comma follows it. If a comma follows it, then you're just getting additional information about the noun. If there's no comma, then it's restricting the noun. That will never have commas, always restricts the noun. Okay, last but not least, effect versus effect. This comes up maybe once every 3 or 4 tests. It would be a shame to lose a question on this. So let's briefly talk about it. Affect with an A is used as an action. It's the verb form. It's a verb. Effect with an E is used as a noun. A lot of times you'll see the before effect because it's saying the noun, but you would never say the verb. I wouldn't say, if I say John ran to the park, I wouldn't say John the ran to the park. So if you see the before it, it's effects. And if it's used in a noun in any way, it's effects. If it's used as a verb, the rising sun verbs the ability of the driver to see, then it's A. Hopefully this video is helpful. Good luck with the worksheet, and feel free to stop by for any other tutorial videos. Okay, bye.